if we can imagine, given our block here, that this is going to be our socket in the subpectoral region of the biceps, and I will put in the guide and drill the guide pin. I drill my socket, I'll deploy my implant. I'm going to push the button, deploy the implant, and once again we pull back before we remove the inserter to ensure that proper deployment. Once you have the implant deployed, because a lot of this comes off and people aren't sure, if they're unfamiliar with the implant, what to do with it. So I am going to unwrap the implant, spread, this is once again a 2/9 ToggleLoc with needles, and I will actually shorten this to some extent because we're going to, and what that does is sort of, this is once again our attachment point, this blue stitch here in the middle. On the 2/9 ToggleLoc without needles, that tendon, that suture, that center loop is white, and I will have my tendon secured, and I usually have a right angle clamp attached to it. I will reach through this loop and pull it back on itself and give me just a little more slack. And then we're going to hold it like that, and you can even just hold those two together. And so this will be the long head biceps tendon coming out of the arm. This is essentially the intra-articular portion that you're going to excise, and generally you do not want the musculotendinous junction to be here at the implant. I think if you're doing that, you're over-tensioning. Now, because this is coming out, what we have often done in the shoulder is we'll take a 20cc syringe. Tends to work well to kind of get in there between the implants so that it can sew down on itself. But I'll even take an 18 gauge needle and pass it through and kind of insert it into the syringe so it holds the whole thing together and it kind of lays it out for you. We have the tendon doubled over through the implant. We've kind of determined our length, and then the process is very similar. This is my preferred technique because I think it's by doubling the tendon over, you create essentially a keyhole tenodesis. So if you look at sort of the literature on the history of biceps tenodeses, that's how they were originally done, was a keyhole with a larger hole proximally and a smaller hole distally, and the tendon was allowed to seat in it was balled up and seated in the socket because they didn't have all of the fixation options that we do today. So we've got one side secured. So once again, the first throw, that one thing I like to emphasize, particularly on the second stitch, see how I will pull, and I want to seat that saddle. And the key here, I think, is to make sure you get both strands of tendon. I don't mind if the sutures overlap. Once again, that's why we used tapered needles. And for those of us that, and so then once I've made those throws, then I will tie this down. I'll cut this. There's generally a stump left of the intra-articular portion of the tendon that I'll remove as well. And so if you'll imagine that this is the socket inside the shoulder, sometimes I will use the back end of a little sin retractor. So once again, that's fully seated. You can, so for demonstration purposes, I'm going to really try to pull on this. But you can see the tendon is very much seated in the socket for a very small tendon with this doubled over technique, and as well as the interference fit in the socket. I mean, this is very secure.